Now, being countercultural is not only to stand against the groups, but to stand against the culture. The culture itself is really interesting. I was dealing with doing a radio program this morning, and we were dealing with the Pope's visit to England, primarily because I do a radio program in England every week. We tape it here, but we record it here, but it's sent by satellite over there. And we were dealing with the Pope's visit and how it went and the problems and the glories of it. And the Pope was ranting and raging that young people were being seduced by secular thinking. I wish it was as simple as that. They are not really secularist. Let me give you the characteristics of secularism from a sociological point of view, because when you use a word, you ought to define it. And when you say secular, what do you mean? Perhaps the best definition of secularism comes from Langdon Gilkey, G-I-L-K-E-Y. Langdon Gilkey, in his book, Naming the Whirlwind. Good title for a book, Naming the Whirlwind. But he says secularity has these characteristics. First of all, the secularist is somebody who believes in temporality. That's a good word, temporality. That means that this life is the only thing there is. I don't find that most young people believe that. They are incredibly mystical. That's why they go into all these vampire movies. And may I point out that 50 years ago, only 20% of young people believed in Satan. Today, it's well over 90% believe that there's a Satan. They do believe in an afterlife. But a secularist says is into temporality. You're born, you live, you die, and that's it. There's no afterlife. Secondly, they believe in contingency. Contingency is that everything that exists, including human beings, has a natural explanation. You see, that this doesn't mean that you are necessarily against evolution. Most of the professors at Eastern, certainly in the biology department, would all be into a kind of evolutionary thought, but they believe that God is at work through the evolutionary process, creating people. That God is the ultimate cause of everything. In the beginning was the Word. In the beginning was God. Secularists said, in the beginning there was the Big Bang. Of course, they never explain where the Big Bang came from, except for Stephen Hawking. He was faced with the reality that he couldn't explain a priori the Big Bang, which occurred, I think, something like 500 billion years ago. But that's when they estimate that it took place. What happened before that? And so he had to come up with a concept that has no empirical validation whatsoever, but it was the only way he could maintain his atheism. I mean, when you're an atheist, you've got to create a belief system because you got to explain things. And his answer was that the universe expands outwardly until it reaches a state of maximum entropy, and then it collapses in upon itself and reforms a new photon, and there's another explosion, so that the universe is simply a constant reoccurrence of a big explosion. The universe as we now have it is going to collapse and become a little tiny photon once again, and boom, it all happened again. Now, there's no empirical evidence to even suggest that this is true, but this is what, in fact, is often circulated in astronomical studies called a pulsating universe. But young people are really not secularists. They don't have any problem believing that there's a God that created. They're not sure the nature of that God and what that God is like because they know almost nothing about the Bible. But they believe there is a God that creates. They believe that this life is, so they're not really secularist. The next thing is relativity. Here they are secularist. That is, there are no absolutes. What is right and what is wrong is contingent upon the society in which you were raised. So if you were raised on the Polynesian Islands, what is right and what is wrong is defined by what goes on in that island. That every society creates its own values, its own standards of right and wrong, that all values are relative. Of course, when you really probe them, they don't really believe that either. For instance, the world unified against South Africa during the days of apartheid. The whole world said it was wrong. If you're a real relativist, you have to stand back and say, You can't make that judgment. How dare people in one society judge the behavior of people in another society? Did most of the white people, and that was most of the population of South Africa in the beginning of that era of apartheid, did most of those, now there's more black people in South Africa than there are white people. They're fleeing out of Zimbabwe, coming across the border. So blacks outnumbered, but whites outnumbered them. They defined the society. What right did the rest of the world have in saying this is wrong? Right now, the Muslim world is under serious attack on the role of women because they all want to belong to the United Nations. But the United Nations has an ethical standard. It has a set of values. If you sign on, you've got to believe in the equality of women. And so, in fact, Saudi Arabia claims that it's into the equality of women, but it's really not. And so there's great tensions here. But the fact is that there are values of right and wrong that seem to transcend all societal systems. So you go to Haiti, and it's a different society. And yes, on minor things, there are great differences of what is right and what is wrong. But in a larger sense, there isn't. They all believe that murdering people is wrong. They all believe that stealing is wrong. How intensely they feel, well, that may vary from one culture to another. But we have a transcendental, get the word, transcending every culture. There is a unity of our perception. I'm not sure that we are really dealing with secularism when we come to that. So we got, let's see, contingency, temporality, relativity, and the last word that defines secularity is autonomy. The only people that are really into autonomy are people like Jean-Paul Sartre, Camus, those existentialist people like Nietzsche. They were into autonomy. Now, you do have to understand this because what has happened is that I'm halfway between autonomy as the existentialists define it and the way in which Christians understand it. Christianity, the Christianity that your kids are going to be into, is basically derived from Greek philosophy. We're more Greek in our thinking than we are biblical. We are more Greek in the way we understand things than we are biblical. For instance, let me pick out something that's very Greek that you tend to believe in. One of your relatives dies. You go to the funeral. They say, we're putting the body in the grave, but the soul has ascended to heaven. And you say, well, what's wrong with that? It's totally unbiblical. The Bible does not teach the immortality of the soul. The Bible teaches the resurrection of the body. Does not Paul write, even as Christ was physically raised from the dead, so shall ye be? You say, but how can that be possible if we all disintegrate into dust? And then we come across with DNA, and to reconstruct the body, all you need is one little cell. But the Bible does not teach the immortality of the soul. The Bible teaches the resurrection of the body. One day, someday, if you go to be with the Lord, you will be able to look at him. You will be able to do what Thomas did. Put your hand into the nail prints in his hand. He has a physically resurrected body. Remember, the resurrected Jesus said, spirit does not have flesh and bones. And Paul writes, even as he was raised from the dead, so shall ye be raised from the dead. The Bible but we're so Greek that when I said this, I'll bet 3/4 of you say, whoa, I never heard this before, because your pastor doesn't preach Christianity. He preaches Greek philosophy. And so the oracle of Delphi says to Socrates, what? Know thyself. That's Greek. Know thyself. Note the presupposition. The presupposition is you have a self waiting to be known. What if you don't have a self? What if you don't have a priori essence to your existence? What if, in fact, you are exactly what Jean-Paul Sartre, the existentialist, said? You are a totally absurd creature. Absurd not in the meaning that you're stupid or anything. You're absurd in that there is no meaning to your life. See, that's what the existentialist would hold. To be perfectly frank, I hold to it too. What, in fact, Sartre said is you are thrust into this world without reason and without purpose. Note, the Greeks would suggest your essence, listen to this, Your essence precedes your existence. Before you ever existed on this planet, you had your essence. In the midst of your earthly existence, you must discover your essence. That's the task of every person. Because there is no self waiting to be found. Quite to the contrary, the self has to be created. And here the existentialists conspire with Christianity and the Bible. Who you are is not a priori defined for you. Who you are, your identity, is established through your commitments. Your commitments define you. You say, well, most kids aren't committed to anything. Exactly. Consequently, most kids what? Have no identity. I am what I commit myself to. Your task as youth workers is not simply to educate kids, but to bring them to what Karl Barth would call a crisis moment, where they have to make a decision as to whether they're going to give themselves over to Jesus or not. Are they going to give themselves to Christ, or are they going to be what? Conformed to this world. They're the options. Most kids will conform to the world. But it's a commitment that's made. Kenneth Keniston, one of the great sociologists of my day, wrote a book called The Uncommitted, describing young people that you're going to be working with. They are basically uncommitted, totally uncommitted. They have no commitments whatsoever. Consequently, T.S. Eliot, the poet, would say, they are, in fact, the straw men, the hollow men, the empty men, blown to and fro by the wind. That's your young people. They are hollow, they are empty, they are blown to and fro by the wind. So you're saying, what are you saying, Campolo? That we're born without any meaning to our lives? That's right. But you don't have to die that way. Here's where Søren Kierkegaard, the Christian existentialist, comes forth. Yes, you are born without meaning, but you can choose meaning. That's where it comes. The Bible is clear that what defines you is your choice. Choose ye this day whom you will serve. As for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. It's a choice, people. It's not a priori. It's not something. And I find that youth workers are constantly dealing with kids who are saying, you know, I'm trying to come to grips with my true identity. Hey, what a cop-out. It's not that simple. You're not going to find out who you are through introspection or through a silent retreat. You've got to make a commitment with your life. Your mission, should you choose to accept it, is to bring people to a commitment. What am I going to commit myself to? What am I going to commit myself to? And therein is my meaning. When they asked John the Baptist who he was, what did he say? I am a voice crying in the wilderness, prepare ye the way of the Lord. You say, wait a minute, that's what you're committed to doing with your life. We want to know what your real identity is. Answer of John is what? My mission in life that I have chosen is my identity. All the way through the scripture, people get their identities through their commitments. And those who have no commitments have no identities.